going to go ahead and say and introduce the panelists. Mr. Edgar Lewis, a Korean and Vietnam War veteran. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Ronald Hutchinson, also a Korean and Vietnam vet. Mr. Jacob Younginger, a Persian Gulf War and Vietnam vet. Mr. Jesse Rice. I've never met him. Thank you. He was so kind to agree to come out. U.S. Marine, and he flies currently, he flies helicopters, emergency, getting people to and from hospitals or wherever the need be. So these are the, did I miss anyone? Oh, Mr. J.T. Holland, the president of the Atlanta chapter, Tuskegee Airmen organization. Yes. But I am going to give this, please, Rick, if you like, but I am accustomed to not having to have a PowerPoint. Thank God for that he gives us gifts where we can improvise immediately. Yeah. And Rick, if you would just, I know it's set where it's like going to continue a slideshow, but if you like to, you can advance in one at a time. Thank you. It's under First Top Gun PowerPoint. See that? Top Gun. Most of you know the Tuskegee Airmen and their service. Of course, they're training at Tuskegee, which is in Alabama. But let me share with you, while we know about Tuskegee in Alabama, that there were several airfields they trained at. Specifically, there was Kennedy Field. There was also Moton Field that is there today. Most people go to Moton Field and they think it's really Tuskegee Army Airfield. But Tuskegee Army Airfield is also there. Of course, it is no longer operative. But the Tuskegee Airmen, so as you go forward in this, as it begins in 1939, Tuskegee Institute, it was about one of 6 black colleges selected to participate in the civilian pilot training program. In 1941, several of those pilots who earned their civilian pilot wings would be the ones to train the Tuskegee Airmen in the primary phase of flying. So the first to really train the Tuskegee Airmen to fly would be the primary phase black instructors. And they were at Moton Field. So that's why you usually hear about Moton Field. But a lot of those men were already at a place called Kennedy Field. The next slide, please. March 1941, it was at Kennedy Airfield. Not Moton Field, nor Tuskegee Army Airfield, that Chief Anderson would give First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt a ride. And actually, based on documents, she asked him to give her a ride, because at Kennedy Field, as you saw in the previous slide, there were black men that had civilian pilot's licenses. So while she was at Tuskegee, she realized blacks are flying. So she asked for a ride. That's how that really happened. She did ask. The next one, please. And the first to train, so in January of 1941, the 99th Pursuit Squadron would be formed. Again, now we're getting to the military side, because blacks were able to fly as civilians, but never in the military, at least not in the American military. So in 41, the 99th Pursuit Squadron is formed. Then in March of 41, the first to train with the 99th are the ground crews. No pilots are starting training yet. And those ground crews were trained at Chanute Field in Rantoul, Illinois. They're the first. And it makes sense that if you're gonna be a segregated base, and blacks are gonna be primarily operating and flying the aircraft, that they would have to train those to know how to operate or really maintain the aircraft, or even the base, to make sure that the things that were needed to run a base was being operated. So the ground crew began training in March of 41. The next slide, thank you. In August of 41, in Tuskegee, Alabama, Major General R. Weaver addresses the first class of black cadets. Actually, there were 13 men in that class. 12 were cadets, and 1 was an officer. And that officer was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who would become the commander of that squadron. So it would be in August, actually, the cadets and the 1 officer arrived at Tuskegee in July. But in August is where they would really have the initiated ceremony that would start, where black military aviators, for the first time, would now become a part of the U.S. Army Air Corps. Okay. 1942, Tuskegee Army Airfield. Original pilots of the U.S. Army Air Corps 99th Pursuit Squadron. They would be redesignated the 99th Fighter Squadron. And these are actually the men. There were about 33 that would make up the very first group that would comprise a squadron. There are a couple missing in the photo, but that is a popular photo of the original 33 that would actually be the first to form a squadron, a complete squadron, and that's the 99th. Also, they were the first black to fly in combat overseas. That makes sense, as they're the first to become part of a squadron, and we know it was the 99th that would be sent overseas in 1943. These were the men that would go over as the pilots. And of course, we had ground crew that went over with them to support them. Yes. 1945, Germany and Japan surrendered, so the war ended in 1945. Because I'm here today with a talk about the first Top Gun, I'm not trying to go into details a lot about the Tuskegee Airmen and their exploits and their flying. I'm to bring in the last hurrah, and there's a piece, which is the ending piece, that I'll be talking about. But in telling that, I want to make sure I brought in the makeup to understand how the organization came into being. So some critical pieces, so that in 1945, Germany and Japan surrenders. In 1946, Tuskegee Army Airfield closes. So really, until March of 46, men were still being trained to fly at Tuskegee, even though the war had ended. So those who had served in combat came back to Tuskegee, those who would stay in. However, in 46, the base is closed, and the 332nd, most of you just heard me talk about the 99th, who were the first pilots with their ground crews, but 3 more squadrons would make up the 332nd, and that was the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd. So the 99th, because of their success in going over first, for a whole year, they were overseas flying. Had they not amassed a track record that would reflect integrity and competency, we might not have ever had those other squadrons. So when we hear 332nd, remember, it comprised, in the end, 4 squadrons. They would bring the 99th over to be with them, but the 99th were already overseas. One piece I will add, because you might meet some Tuskegee Airmen who will say, I was with the 99th. And you say, oh, well, when you flew a P-51 Red Tail, they said, I didn't fly a P-51, because some of them came back. See, they're the first to go over. Some of those gentlemen with the 99th would actually come back to the U.S. and become instructors too. So in 1947, the 332nd Fighter Group is reactivated at Lockbourne in Ohio. So they close Tuskegee. A lot of people leave the military, but there's a group that would end up at Lockbourne in Ohio. Okay. And actually this says war-famed Red-tailed Fighter Group reactivated, so that was an article I found. And while they are there, Those men will strictly fly and work on P-47s, known as the Thunderbolt. So they were called the Thunderbolt Wing. Yes. Another piece of history for the Tuskegee Airmen, who we know of their record in combat as far as they really stuck close to the bombers. They did not amass a lot of aces at all in combat, where you shoot down 5 or more enemy aircraft. So they stuck with them, like Commander B.O. Davis Jr. said, it's important to bring those bombers home safely. It's important to help get them to their destination, to drop their bombs. It is not about you shooting the enemy and getting points and scores as aces. So it's said the Tuskegee Airmen might have had 1 ace, but according to records, they are saying there really was not one. So this is why this whole story about the first Top Gun is important. So in 1948, Tech Sergeant Mal Whitfield of the 332nd demonstrates his on-your-mark position. While on active duty, now they're at Lockbourne, Mal Whitfield was such a fast runner in track and field, and he's on active duty. He's allowed to go to the London Olympics, and he won 2 gold medals, a Tuskegee Airman. The first known on active duty to ever do that was a Tuskegee Airman. You've probably seen his daughter, Frederica Whitfield, on CNN.
Yes.
So when she proudly speaks of her father, a Tuskegee Airman, that was Mr. Malvin Whitfield. Getting to the Top Gun part of this story, and why are we calling it Top Gun? In 1949, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force sent out a directive to all the fighter groups, and this included, for the first time ever, blacks, that they would get a directive saying that there will be a gunnery competition at Las Vegas. We want each fighter group to select 4 men to compete in that competition. It's going to be a 10-day competition, shooting at targets in the air and on the ground. And when that competition ends, we will find out who the top honored teams are. So there's going to be a jet class competition and a conventional class competition. Conventional class is where you fly the propeller aircraft. So the Tuskegee Airmen would be in that group of conventional class flyers. There were 12 teams, 7 flew jets, 5 flew conventional aircraft. He said, how do you determine which 4 were going to fly for us? They would use the scores from another competition, because they had competitions among themselves. So they decided they would use the highest score from a competition that they held earlier in Eglin, at Eglin Air Force Base. So that's where they would use those scores to determine who would be the pilots for the 332nd. The men selected were Alva Temple of the 301st Fighter Squadron, First Lieutenant Harry Stewart of the 100th Fighter Squadron, First Lieutenant James Harvey of the 99th Fighter Squadron, and that 4th person really was an alternate, Halbert Alexander. So during that 10-day competition, and this is a photo of the 4 men with the P-47. The other teams that were in the conventional meet or competition, they flew P-51s. They were the only ones flying P-47 in that conventional class meet. And these are the 4 men that would go to Las Vegas. Here they are flying the P-47 Thunderbolts. They called them jugs, they said because of the shape, but they loved them in combat. I hear that Harry Stewart, who is one of those pilots that's flying in this competition for the 332nd, he shot down 3 planes April 1st, 1945. Even though he was flying a P-51, Harry said those Thunderbolts were the most sturdiest. So because they were the Thunderbolt wing, they actually had what we would say older aircraft. They weren't the more modern P-51. Okay. I had to make sure I could not leave out ground crew because we know that the planes could not fly if they did not have good mechanics or those on the ground to make sure that the plane was operable. So here we have one of the ground crew, Chief Buford Johnson, he's a crew chief of the 99th Fighter Group. So again, remember you saw the 4 men? Even though they're with the 332nd, there are still squadrons they're in. The 332nd is the group. And in that group, there were the squadrons. So he was with the 99th. And he was responsible for maintaining the aircraft that Lieutenant Colonel Harvey would fly. Okay? He just died about, actually, within the last 2-3 weeks. The last of the crew chief that would maintain, that was there in Las Vegas. So, Mr. Johnson, next one, please. So before I get to this part and where they're standing here, is that there's a piece of the story about the Top Gun that tells you really just how resilient these men were. Mind you that it was still a segregated unit they were a part of. And during this competition, I said there were 12 teams, 7 flew jets, 5 flew the conventional aircraft. Well, one of the teams actually that was flying an F-82, that is like a P-51 with what, 2 fuselages? So 2 people could ride. One of the men of the 332nd Fighter Group, one of the ground crew, wanted to be able to ride in that empty seat, and they allowed him to do that during a skip bombing. So unfortunately, the pilot, who happened to be a white pilot, crashed that day and he died. And of course, so did the Tuskegee Airmen. His name was Ray Austin. He was killed. The next day, because of what had happened, and these men, the ground crew, the 332nd ground crew had been working day in, day out to make sure those planes were ready those 10 days. They decided they would go into town there in Vegas and have a drink. They said, you know, we're feeling down because our friend Ray is deceased. And they go into the Flamingo and they are ousted out. Blacks are not allowed there. The irony of this story is when that competition ended, the 332nd had the highest score. They won the competition. And this trophy, they're at the ceremony, occurred at the Flamingo. You know, so of course, as Buford Johnson would tell us, and I said, well, Mr. Johnson, so now when you go back again, what do they say? And he says, nothing. Actually, B.O. Davis Jr. is with us, and we all walk in just as proud. But this trophy that you see now, the Tuskegee Airmen won the conventional class competition. The 4th Fighter Wing won the jet competition. So the men from the jet competition went up, and they're standing with the same large trophy you see here. Then after they are, well, after the ceremony, it's time for the 332nd winners to go up, those pilots. They go up to the same table, and they are honored with the same trophy. That trophy, that large trophy, belongs to the Air Force. The Air Force agreed that this would be an annual event, that every year a name would be added onto the base, and as the years got longer, there would be a scroll of names. These men, who were a part of the conventional class first winning team, thought that they would see this trophy at the Pentagon. That's where it was to stay, at the Pentagon. They said, we should go and look, and it was never there. And over the years, they wondered about that trophy. Now, mind you, this is 1949 that they win the competition. I would meet Alva Temple at an event at Columbus, Mississippi. And Alva Temple, who is the gentleman, I don't have a pointer, sorry, here. Alva Temple was the captain of the team. He also served overseas in World War II. He flew all of the aircraft. He stayed in, he got to fly even the P-51s. But Alva Temple shared with me how we were the first Top Gun, and that was in 2004.